Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Completing Access to Broadband, or CAB, update webinar for the North Carolina Department of Information Technologies Division of Broadband and Digital Equity. My name is Crystal Dickerson. I am the Communications and Marketing Manager for the division. We have a lot of attendees today. We have a lot of content to share with you. So please be patient as we allow folks to continue to join in from the lobby. We are recording this webinar. We will be replacing a copy of the recording up on our website. So we'll make sure that you're aware of when that is available. If you have any questions, please do add them to the chat. We will get to them as we can. If there are any questions that we cannot answer during the webinar, we'll make sure and either add them to our FAQs, add them to the website, or if you include your name, we'll reach back out to you afterwards. So just one more minute, we'll let some additional folks in. And then I'm going to hand it over now to Angie Bailey. She is the Director of the Broadband Infrastructure Office. She's joined here by some other members of her team and the NCDIT team. Angie?
Thank you, Crystal. Thanks, everybody, for being with us today. Hope everybody is having a somewhat calm and productive start to the new year. I know we had originally we were planning to have this right before Christmas break, and then we felt like it's better to pause and reconvene with y'all today. So thanks for being here. So I'm Director of the Broadband Infrastructure Office. I am joined by Ben Shelton, who is our project manager. He's with the Center for Geographic Information and Analysis, which is a sister office of ours at DIT. Responsible for mapping for the state. Stephanie Jane Edwards is our broadband data and mapping lead for the Broadband Infrastructure Office and the division. And Jeff Brooks, you all know from our Infrastructure Solutions team. So we have, today is an update webinar. So it's covering content that we have shared in the past, but we wanted to kind of revisit some of it. So if we can move to the next slide. And I want to really thank Crystal Dickerson for all of her amazing comms work. And we could not put all these pieces together without her. So thank you, Crystal. Okay, so we began sharing this content with you all last month. So hopefully y'all were able to participate in the webinar for the providers or the counties. So this isn't Groundhog Day, the movie, but we really felt like it's so much content that we needed to kind of repeat some of it. We've added details. The other major piece is that everything we kind of shared last month is now in the CAB guidance document. So that was republished on Wednesday this week. And so now all this information is written out. And so we're kind of moving forward with the mapping processes that we need to launch the CAB bids. So as y'all remember, we talked about the NC Broadband Funding Map that was published December 1st. So that's a map of the publicly funded project areas where we have broadband funding in the state. We published the Completing Access to Broadband Eligible Locations layers on December 13th. So that's a huge piece of what we need to move into the CAB bids. So it shows by location what locations in each county are eligible for CAB. As I mentioned, the CAB guidance is now updated and republished. We are going to open our window for collecting protected areas data January 8th through the 29th. So that's collecting data from broadband providers. And I'm just giving a high level overview, and then we'll repeat all this in more detail. So that's going to be a data collection from broadband providers that have publicly funded broadband projects to make sure that we have, that we're all in agreement on the exact parameters of those projects, the exact boundaries and things. We don't expect a lot of changes because, this data is coming from the FCC and from our own grant areas, but nevertheless, we need to kind of run through that process to make sure we have all the exact data in place. We also are opening the CAB statewide protest process window on Monday. That will run from January 8th through the 29th. Again, we don't expect a lot of protests either. These would be coming from broadband providers that believe a location to be served that's reflected as unserved. But we, because this data is now at the location level, these broadband providers are reporting it directly to the FCC. That's where this data is coming from. So we don't expect a lot of changes, but that process will run over the next few weeks. We have some clarifications and reminders to go through today in these different sections. I did want to quickly touch on our licensing. We did have a licensing webinar on December 7th. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to be there. We have some clarifications that we've published on our webpage. So we've worked with CostQuest to kind of define the parameters around those Tier D and Tier E licenses. So that's on our website now. I think one thing that gets confusing is that these licenses were created really for the BEAD program. So it's CostQuest working with NTIA on BEAD licensing. And so now they've kind of folded in other federal programs like the ARPA funds that we're still awarding in North Carolina. So there's kind of this translation required between BEAD language and ARPA program language. So we have some clarifications on that. I think one other difference, just to kind of note, a lot of states are moving into BEAD in North Carolina. Of course, we had, I think, one of the largest ARPA appropriations for broadband in the country. It was appropriated, I think, last of any state, and we have the most programs. So that's why you're going to be hearing a lot about BEAD. North Carolina, we're still pushing out our ARPA funds this year, so as you all know. And then the Q&A section, we do want to ask you about office hours, if those will be helpful to you, what content, counties, providers. So we'll talk about that a little bit at the end. All right, so next slide, please. So one action, we really need you to kind of peek at the CAB guidance. It is republished, and so I just wanted to highlight the sections to look at. Section 3 outlines funding of mutually identified CAB projects, and so that kind of goes through the work with the county specifically. And so if you can look at those sections, especially like the section C, identification of eligible locations and prioritization of areas, that's really important. Next slide, please. And then the other major section, which is basically the whole section is new. It's long. It's section 6, CAB project areas. And so all these things that we're talking about and we talked about last month are these mapping sections A through I. And so this is a written, we do want y'all to read all of the rules, not just and guidelines, parameters, not just kind of what we're sharing through slides. So we hope you will look at that as well. Next slide, please. And so we have just this quick bullet list for you all, because I know this is a lot. The actions to kind of focus on that will as we go through all these steps. We do need data contacts from broadband providers and counties to be able to share data with you all. So Stephanie Jane's going to talk about how to submit those. We do need our broadband providers to have the CostQuest Tier D license. Counties can apply for a Tier E license, that you don't have to have a license. So please don't get too overwhelmed. The license is, as Stephanie Jane and Ben will talk about, is to be able to deal with the individual addresses directly or broadband serviceable locations, but you can view this information without a license, at a hex bin level. Well, you can view it anyway. They'll cover that. Sorry, I don't want to go into too much on these slides. So that's an action item to be aware of. Protected areas data submission, as we mentioned, that window is opening for providers on Monday. That is going to be a continual process in some sense, and that there's always going to be more protected areas that we need to keep track of with you all. But we do want you all to look at the map that we have now and send us any corrections so that we can get that resolved before the CAB window. Statewide protest process, as mentioned, and then county priority areas. And again, that's optional also. So those are kind of the key action items to pay attention to. Next slide. Yeah, and so now we'll move into actual content. And so I'll turn it over to Ben to talk about the first pieces of mapping. Thank y'all.
Thanks, Angie. Appreciate it. So my name is Ben Shelton, like Angie mentioned. I'm project manager at the sister agency, North Carolina Center for Geographic Information Analysis. And so what I'll focus on today is kind of the mapping content. I put the link to the broadband page on NC1 map in the chat if anybody's interested to kind of follow along. But on that page, so if you go to nc1map.gov, there's a broadband initiative card on that main page that will take you to our broadband page. And on that broadband page, we put all of the information, all the data and maps that we put together, everything that we can make publicly available, we put on this website. And specifically, I want to focus today on that planning section. It's about halfway down the page. And on that planning section, there's a couple cards that, as Angie mentioned, we have the NC broadband funding card, which we kind of detailed in a previous webinar, which is up, the recording of that is up on the Broadband Infrastructure Office website. So I won't get too into the details of that broadband funding map, but particularly today, I want to focus on a lot of the changes we've made to the CAB planning tool, which is right there in the middle of that planning section. And each of these cards has a data and a view button. So if you're interested in getting data from these maps and using it in your own software packages locally, that data button is a great resource to go and look at all the data that we're putting out publicly. And then the view button will take you into some online mapping tools that you can visualize the data and kind of get a good picture of what's going on in the county and state. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, that broadband funding map, I won't get too much into detail, but just know that this is where we're putting out all the protected areas, all of those previous projects, either federal or state, that we have kind of tried to migrate into the FCC's broadband serviceable location data set. A lot of those projects, all of them are defined in previous data sets, whether it's census blocks, parcels, addresses. And what we've done is we've tried to make a best effort of translating those into the new FCC broadband serviceable location data set so that we're not double funding a location going forward and protecting those areas. So this broadband funding map is primarily geared towards providers. And what we're asking providers is to give us feedback if these locations are either overstating or understating a project area, or maybe it's just completely missing a project off the map that needs to be protected. And so you can visualize what we've protected on this map at the BSL level, but there's also download options there. If you see the highlighted icons there in red, you can filter and download these tables for both federal and state funded locations, but you will need a CostQuest license to be able to use those tables once they're downloaded and join it to the spatial information in that CostQuest data set. Next slide. And just very quickly, this is kind of an overview of how we translated everything into the broadband serviceable location data set. Those are different data sets for different purposes. A lot of the projects were defined in census blocks or parcels or address and fee data at the state level. And so in those instances, what we did is in this example, we took the award data in the green points. We intersected that with parcels, the statewide parcels that CGIA maintains. We work with counties and aggregate all the parcels across the state. And that data is very critical in allowing us to then intersect those awards with the parcels, and then using that selected parcel data set, selecting all the BSLs that fall within those parcels to kind of protect those areas and say that, okay, these are the same as this previous award. And we do that for past awards from 2018 through 2023. And whether we have final builds for those projects, we use the final builds in those instances. If it's still a pending project, then we go back to the contract data and use the awarded contract to then outline those projects in BSLs going forward so that we don't double fund a location. And in this view, you'll see that the color-coded parcels just mean kind of, this is how we QC our results. This is, the green ones are kind of one-to-one matches. There was one parcel or one award location, and we got one BSL. And then instances where there's orange, it's kind of a difference. There's two locations on that parcel where there's only one BSL. So you can see it's not a very clean process. It's just different data for different purposes. So we don't expect it to be a 100% match, but this allows us to kind of drill down and kind of QC our results. And then if there's a red parcel there, that means that there was no BSL location on that parcel. And if there is a building there and we believe it's a serviceable location, we are rolling those into our FCC fabric challenges to try to get those locations added to the map. But some instances there may not be a serviceable location there, but it's a valid address that we used back in those grant rounds. If you go to the next slide, please. And in cases where it's a federal award, what we've done is we go to the funding map that the FCC puts out. They make available all of the federal projects. I believe most of those are census block based definitions of those project areas. So what we did in those instances, we take those census blocks, we intersect those with the BSLs. Anything that falls within that census block, we protect and make ineligible for future funding. And in those instances, I mean, these are particularly instances where we are asking providers to say, look at those. If the project is not a full census block, we really need to know exactly which BSLs are in that project area so that we can allow those additional fringe locations to be available for future funding through the CAB program. And if you go to the next slide, please. So what we're asking providers to do is tell us where our maps are incorrect. You know, QC those protected areas. Give us some CSV files that actually show the actual builds or the actual project locations in the BSLs. Stephanie Jane will get a little bit more into the details of how to provide that data and where to submit it. But it's all going to be done through the Broadband Infrastructure Office Data Exchange, which is an AWS interface where you can upload files and get credentials to securely give us data on where your project locations really should be. So we'll get a little bit more into detail on how to do that and where the templates are and things like that. So Stephanie Jane will talk more about that going forward. Next slide, please. And like I said, particularly this webinar, we wanted to focus a lot on the CAB planning tool. We made a tremendous amount of change to this interface in basically the last 3 weeks. So when you open this data or this tool using that view button in that CAB planning tool card on the broadband page, here's the kind of where it comes in at. And what you're seeing here is aggregated unserved locations from the FCC's broadband data collection. And we've used those unserved locations and aggregated them to hex bins. And those hex bins are kind of symbolized in a bivariate symbolization. And all that means is if you see darker shades of pink in a hex bin, that means it's a higher count of unserved locations in that hex bin. If there's a darker shade of blue, that means it's a higher percentage of unserved locations out of the total BSLs in that hex bin. And then if you combine those two colors, the darker shades of purple mean that's a higher count and a higher percentage of unserved locations in the hex bin, which really kind of helps you dial down into the high concentrations of unserved locations across the state pretty quickly and pretty easily. And if you're interested in more details on that symbolization or any of the functionality of this tool, there's a CAB planning tool help document that's linked down there in the bottom left. And that'll kind of get into, you know, exactly what is our definition of unserved and what is our definition of underserved, how the tool works, how to filter, and how the different functionalities work. It'll also give you details about how to access the data using that data button back on the broadband page, and you know how you can download, filter, and do things like that, and bring those layers in locally. If you go to the next slide. Yeah, and I really recommend using the county filter at the top right of the tool here. In this example, you'll see I've filtered by Beaufort County. And when you do that, it kind of zooms in and it filters all the data sets based on Beaufort County. You'll see the infographic there in the bottom right has also filtered to kind of update how many unserved locations and underserved locations are in that specific county. And then if you zoom in a little bit further than a county level, you'll see what this is showing here is the actual BSLs, the actual eligible locations displaying on the map on top of the hex bins. So the hex bins get a little bit more granular as you zoom in, but also the points show you exactly where those locations are. And in this example, the red locations are the unserved locations based on our definition of unserved that we're using for this CAB round. The orange are the underserved locations. So in this example, you'll see there's unserved there around Little Washington, but there's also a lot of underserved there to the east of Little Washington. The gray locations on this example are the served locations. So those are BSLs as well, but those are served and not eligible for funding. And then we also have the blue locations at the top of the map. Those are federally funded locations based on that protected areas map. It's the same data that we have in that funding map. And then there's some green locations that you probably can't see on this slide, but there are green locations. Those are state funded locations. So they may be unserved or underserved, but they're not eligible for CAB funding because they have previous funding already allocated. And as you see, when you zoom into the map and you can select a county filter, there's also a few different things and options that are available for you. And if you go to the next slide, please, Crystal. On the right-hand side, you'll see there's a list of providers and technologies that get populated when you filter by county. And so what you can do with that is say, okay, in Beaufort County, these are the providers and these are the technologies that have been reported through the broadband data collection. And in this example, I've selected one of those providers in that list, River Street Fiber. And you can see where River Street has reported fiber service in Beaufort County by selecting that layer. So that's the yellow hex bins that come on top. And so what you're seeing there is, okay, there's all these underserved locations east of Little Washington, but by selecting River Street Fiber, okay, well, there is fiber reported in that area. It's just not being reported at a level that would consider it served. So it's for some reason, it's not reported at above 100 download and 20 upload. So in that instance, you get a little better picture of not only where the unserved and underserved, but what's the infrastructure that is already being reported in those areas that might help you understand where the project areas could be. And if you select a hex bin, like I have in this example, you'll get a pop-up here and it'll define exactly how many eligible locations there are. So that's unserved and underserved added together and with the funded locations removed. So these are just the eligible locations for this round of CAB. You also see all the other information about how many fiber locations have been reported, cable, and how many unserved and underserved and things like that, how many total locations. So there's a lot of information in those hex bin layers. And I'll show you here in a second where you can actually pull in that hex bin layer locally if you have those capabilities. And then the last I mentioned is at the bottom of the map, you'll see there's unserved, there's a tab for underserved, and there's also a tab for fiber service and cable service. So once you've filtered by county, if you go to those bottom tabs, you also get views of Beaufort County showing where the underserved are in a hex bin layer aggregation, where the fiber service is, and where the cable service is. So just quickly, you can kind of get a picture of what's going on in the county and where different resources may be. And all of this is using the hex bin layer. The hex bin layer has all of these attributes and it's just being filtered and symbolized differently in each of these maps. So if you go to the next slide, please. If you're interested in getting that hex bin layer, getting access to it, that data button in that CAB planning tool will allow you to go in and see a list of all the data sources that we have available. And access them either through streaming services or downloadable tables or shapefiles, KML, things like that. It'll also give you all the metadata, some description on kind of what's in the layers, how we created them, what you can do with them, what the date stamps are. If we make updates, we'll try to keep the metadata up to date so that you can always be sure of what version you're using. In that hex bin layer specifically, there are fields, like I mentioned, that show eligible locations in each hex bin, unserved locations, percents, all of that good stuff. And we recommend really using that level 8 hex bin, and it really gives you that granular look at a county level and allows you to communicate with us without a CostQuest license. So if we're looking at defining project areas, setting priority areas at a county level, that hex bin layer is how we can communicate without having to go through all that CostQuest license. And if you don't have that, then we can communicate using the hex bin layer. So definitely a very important one to highlight. And you can get to that again using the data button in the CAB planning tool. Get you a list and then just go to the NCFCC broadband data collection aggregated to hex bin layer, and that'll get you everything you need. Go to the next slide, please. Now, if you have a CostQuest license, there's also an option in that data button in the list of layers. There are tables for both unserved and underserved in the state. And so by selecting those layers, you can come into a view like this, and it will show you the location ID, service flag, and county fields for both unserved and underserved. This is showing unserved here, and you can filter by county and download all of this data as you need it, and then map things if you have a CostQuest license. So you can join that location ID to your own Fabric data set and pull in all of our defined unserved and underserved locations into your own mapping software. One point will be that the service flag here is representing if there is a in that field, that means that that location has no reported service at all. You know, we've received some feedback from some counties that want to prioritize locations that have no service at all before we go into even other unserved locations. Well, that service flag field is key to understanding where a location is that has no reported service at all. So even if they're both unserved, one has some service that's just less than 25.3, and then others just don't have any service reporting. And so you can see that service flag field there. And so in this example, if you see that red square, that's the filter button. You go into that filter, you can filter by county. In this example, I just typed in Burke County and filtered by Burke County. And then if you go to the next slide, please, Crystal. So once you have that filter applied and you have that toggle filter button turned on, you can download just that filtered data set. And that might be a little quicker than trying to download the whole state through this interface on NC1 Map. So once you've had that toggle filter, you click download. It'll take a minute and it might spin for a little while, but if you let it go, you'll see that table gets downloaded into a CSV file. If you're interested in just the whole state, you don't want to filter, you don't want to mess with this interface, we also have a direct download button, that bottom link there. And so if you click that, it will just reach out to our Amazon server and download the whole data set into a zip file for both unserved and underserved in one zip file. So we're trying to give you a lot of options to get this data set. And if you go to the next slide. And here's where I think I'll turn it to Stephanie Jane to get a little bit more detail about our definitions.
Thank you, Ben. And wanted to just kind of follow through on what these processes might look like once you've had a chance to review these eligible locations that are new in our publicly viewable data sets and our maps, kind of familiarize yourself with those, and then just be aware that there were some data modifications that we utilized several factors of policy, including coming into alignment with guidelines from our funder, U.S. Treasury, on scalability and 100 megabits per second symmetrical emphasis for this program. And so those are outlined here. And then they're also outlined in the help document of the CAB planning tool, which is linked here from the title of this slide. So if you go to the CAB planning tool, you can also click on a link to see where this is spelled out. And I just wanted to mention it because there are a few tweaks we made to retain eligibility for funding for certain locations to be inclusive in projects that we're reviewing and receiving for the CAB program. If you go to the next slide, this is about the protest process, because we will want the protests on any data that we receive to be in line with those data modifications that I just mentioned. And what this process will look like is essentially two phases, where we start by getting input from internet service providers across the state on data statewide. And that's the 20-day window that Angie has mentioned, being starting Monday, January 8th through January 29th. And then there will be a second stage once we have collected and published all of the county prioritization areas that we receive into the CAB planning tool. There'll be an additional 10-day window for that second bullet there, protest submissions regarding those eligible locations again, but just like with a little bit further down the timeline, you know, in case anything very recent has changed, or if any opportunities were missed in the first round of the protest that you feel are particularly relevant in light of the county prioritized areas for CAB. That will involve submitting a CSV file with the broadband serviceable locations, a no-cost Tier D license from CostQuest is required for that, which most of our internet service providers are already have or are in the process of obtaining. And then we'll have some fields in there about the reason for the protest and the details of what the correction is that needs to be made or is suggesting to be made. And then we'll be sending instructional information and templates that can be used to create that CSV file to our data contacts, which we've mentioned we'd really like to have identified from each broadband provider to set us up for this process. If you are alerting us to the primary kind of motive and rationale for the protest process would be alerting us to areas that are already served today. End users can't have that service available today as of the protest, that may still be showing for whatever reason as unserved and eligible for funding in our CAB planning tool. That might include situations where there was build out more recently than your most recent data sent to FCC for the broadband data collection, so that it had no way of capturing it. If there was any stray errors or omissions through our crosswalk process or for any other reason, this does not include projects that are not involved in a protected area with a contracted commitment, but it's just privately funded planned service. That does come into play under some BEAD programs, but under the purposes of this this round of CAB, that does not qualify for the protected areas input and protest process. So that's just important to be aware of. And there is all of this information is described in pretty good detail in the CAB guidance document that's available on our CAB webpage. So check that out for all the additional details. If we go to the next slide, I'll just kind of go into some detail. I think we've covered this before, but a recap of the secure data folders that are stored in the cloud and available through your browser, where you can submit data for this protest process and for all the processes before, during, and after in the CAB program. So we have Amazon Web Services buckets, which you can access through a link that will be sent out to all of these data contacts. If you can email broadband mapping at nc.gov, that's here on the slide, and perhaps have that data contact person email this with contact information, and we will respond with the instructions for how to use these data folders through your browser and the login credentials. We'll be sending instructions and a username, as well as in a separate email, the passcodes required to log in. And each county and each internet provider will have their own private folder that only they can access. And so people will not be able to view data or download data from any other folders but their own, but they have their own secure and private access to that folder, similar to an FTP site. So you'll have those credentials issued. You can upload files and there'll be timestamps. You'll be able to see what you've uploaded and capture that, and we'll get automated notifications of data that comes in to help us take action on that. If we go to the next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about the county prioritization areas that will be that we've already kind of started brainstorming. You may have met me in a few county meetings with Jeff Brooks. And so I know a lot of participating counties are already thinking about what areas within their county and what factors within their county should warrant prioritization, where we would like to see infrastructure being boosted first. And so this is a little bit of a recap too, but that will, on our publicly viewable website, end up looking similar to this sample image here, where you've got the hexagon cells. Those are level 8 hexagon cells showing where, in this case, this is actually a fiber footprint, but imagine that this is locations that a county has deemed a priority area, and it could be because of vulnerable populations that are particularly underserved. It could be you're hearing from constituents saying they're having real struggles that are affecting public safety or education or employment issues. It could be a particularly troublesome corridor along a particular road or waterway. It could be areas around farms or schools, but you just need to come up with mappable data and or a descriptive narrative, perhaps even a supplemental file, polygon file that our office can use to map and easily translate that to these hexagons and broadband serviceable locations. So we primarily want to receive this data as broadband serviceable locations. If the county has a license to work with that location level data, that's recommended if you can do that. But if you cannot, we can work with you using these level 8 hexagons that are downloadable, and they are clipped to the borders of your county so that there's not any project area bleeding over into an area outside of the county. All the funds will focus inside the county. We'll work with these CSV file templates, and then we'll be able to communicate with the hex bins, including unique ID numbers that belong to them. So hopefully that helps out with the county prioritization process. And like I mentioned, we are going to publish the resulting priority areas in the CAB planning tool for everyone to reference in the following steps of the program. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to be talking about where we go from that prioritization. There will be, that additional 10-day window to just double check on anything else that may need to be included in the protest process. So providers, feel free to take note of that, send that in. And then once all of that is finalized, the priority areas and the protest process, it will be time to submit proposed CAB projects into those web folders that I talked about. And then we also have a system that you may be familiar with for the applications themselves, but we're looking for data files to come into our Amazon Web Services folders in the form of a CSV file with those broadband serviceable location IDs. That just means you're being specific to the location level, and you're not including any of the things that run us into proprietary data issues. It's just the location ID that only us as a state office with our license can link to dots on the map. And so we'll be providing templates that you can use to create that CSV file and PDF instructions by email to your data contacts. And we'll be aggregating this data for public viewing in the CAB planning tool map to those hexagon layers. So it should be fairly easy to follow for people who do not have licenses. Although if you zoom in far enough, you can see little bits at a time of the dots, and those are not downloadable. We are allowed to do that. So there'll be plenty to reference once we get to this point. And we just wanted to note that it will be advantageous for these proposed projects to take into account the prioritized areas and to reach as many eligible BSLs or broadband serviceable locations within those priority scopes of work that we received input on from counties, because this is very centered around community needs and goals. It's also going to be advantageous if you want to download that hexagon layer to think about your projects reaching as many unserved and underserved eligible locations, like get to 100% of those in as many level 8 hexagons as possible. That is not a requirement, but it will help you out in our evaluation process. If you go to the next slide, I just wanted to recap and sort of summarize information about these CostQuest licenses we keep mentioning, because I know it's new and confusing, and ideally we wouldn't have to have licenses to work with this location level data, but that is how it's come about at the national level. And then we have the opportunity to acquire these licenses at no cost other than the time we put into it, to have expanded allowable uses of this location level data, which is those dots on the map. The Tier D license is going to be most helpful for our broadband providers, because that allows you to give input onto the protest process, but also to become an awardee in broadband funded programs. They have to be federally funded programs, as this one is. The Tier E license is still the recommended license, probably going to be most helpful for participating counties to give input into these processes, like the prioritization and the it's kind of a foundational piece of our protest process. If you watch our December 7th webinar, where we had a guest speaker from CostQuest talking about the steps to get these licenses, there's some helpful information there, but you might also find that they're using the term challenge process because they're accustomed to talking about BEAD. And when it comes to the CAB program, that's really applicable to this protest process that's the term that we've been using in our programs here. So if you have any questions about that, you can get more details. There's a new FAQ section about licensing, a link to that from this webpage here, ncbroadband.gov/CAB. And we also are happy to work with you on this. There's a little bit more reference information on the next slide here, because CostQuest has put together some license guides that walk you through the steps. So if you're a provider still working to get a Tier D license, this link should get you started on all the steps. And give you basically all the information I just covered, as well as a separate document for Tier E licenses. And the steps are very similar for both. There's just a little bit more questions for the Tier D license. And the very first step for both is you want to get an FCC registration number, which is actually a pretty straightforward thing that you can do online in a kind of automated way. And then it takes you from there. So you can read our FAQs that I mentioned already. And CostQuest has an information desk, a help desk. So if you have questions specific to your organization, or you get stuck at any point, you can email ifasupport@costquest.com, and they should be able to get you unstuck and work with you on identifying what is for sure the most appropriate license for your organization. Because while we can provide general information and what makes sense for our programs, there are, exceptions and situations in which your particular company or county may be planning to participate in some other programs at a higher level or not. So just feel free to send any additional questions if things aren't already crystal clear to that email address there, or to get in touch with our office. We will be receiving a weekly report from CostQuest summarizing who has completed the process to obtain these licenses, but we are really leaving counties and internet providers in the driver's seat on whether to get a license and what's the appropriate one. And I think the process typically takes less than 2 weeks, or down to maybe a few business days in some cases, depending on how long it takes you to review and that sort of thing. If we go to the next slide, though, I'm just going to give a quick recap of everything that we've been talking about. You saw this slide before, but just to kind of help boilerplate this down a little bit of actions and input that is needed next. Do please email broadbandmapping@nc.gov with the data contacts, that the individuals that you would like to be working with us on data, and we will create a list of those and follow up as needed on those nuts and bolts items for data. And we will also know that it's okay for that person to be authorized to receive the login credentials for our secure data exchange website. Number 2, those licenses that we just covered, and just remember the Tier E license. If counties are not able to obtain a license for that location level data quickly enough to be useful for this round of CAB program, we do have that workaround to communicate with you via those hexagons, which are about just over 1/4 of a square mile in area. So it's not quite as precise, but it should get the job done for a lot of your strategies. The protected areas, we really want that input during the same time window as the protest process from that funded area map. Providers, if you could let us know if you see any discrepancies between what's in that map that is sourced from the federal funding map combined with our crosswalk process for great grant awards. Please send that in to us using those the same data exchange website with those folders. The statewide protest process will be, as we've mentioned, January 8th through 29th. And then we just did want to, counties can be, I'm going to put this answer too in the chat because I saw Tricia was asking, the county priority areas can be strategized and formed now through during the protest process, but we did want to make it clear that there is some additional time after January 29th, and the protest process finalizes all the eligible locations that counties can send to us in those cloud folders, the county priority areas. So if you want to work with us on that or work internally on that, you can go ahead and be doing that based on the eligible locations that are already published in the CAB planning tool. But just be aware there'll be some finalization of that as a result of the protest process windows that may be of interest to you and may be relevant to what you're trying to prioritize it may turn out that some of the locations you're prioritizing turn out to be served after all. So just keep an eye on that. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to kind of cover a boilerplate of programmatic next steps to be thinking about.
So good morning, everyone. I appreciate everyone being here this morning. We've been working on CAB as a team, as an office for a long time, and so much of the input for helping make this program what it is today and the success it's going to be is thanks to all of your efforts and your contributions to helping us define this. I think that everyone appreciates and understands the criticality and the importance of mapping and the locations. So I'd like to thank Ben and Stephanie Jane for just superb work in helping to lay this out. And it's obvious how important it is because it's taken up the bulk of this presentation. From a programmatic perspective, we've been, I think, fairly consistent in trying to outline the process by which we'll be moving forward in working with individual counties. December 1st, the office mailed out county commitment forms to all 100 counties. And of particular interest to us are the 39 counties that have initially indicated their desire to participate in CAB. We're looking to receive those forms back. Within those forms, there's the opportunity for a county to, again, commit to the amount of dollars that they want to put into a CAB project, as well as to indicate the source of funds for that project. We'd love to get those forms back as quickly as possible because even though this is a rolling program, the sooner we get a form back from a county, the sooner we can inject that county into the process and begin to move forward. The next component is, and again, this is based on previous correspondence, we're looking for the selection of evaluation team members from each county. By default, we're looking for the county manager to be a part of that evaluation team, along with folks from our office. But we also suggested or invited the county manager to add an additional person to that team. So the sooner that you make a decision that you want another person to participate in this process, we'd love to get that information from you. Within the next several weeks, you will get a copy of the statement of work or the scope of work document from us. Again, we've discussed this in the past, but this really is going to be the document that gets placed on the interactive purchasing system whenever we open a county up for a CAB project. It's this document that will contain all of the nuts and bolts required for a provider to respond to the, sorry about that. To respond to the bid that's out there, to the scope of work document that's been placed out there. So instructions in terms of how to upload information into the EBS portal, instructions in terms of what information is required, all of that will be contained in the scope of work. We'll be reviewing that with counties within the next 2 to 3 weeks. And with that, I'll give it back to Angie.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jeff. So this is our last slide. Just to say again, we are looking at how we could best structure office hours. We're trying to decide if it should be just providers and then just counties, or all together, is just mapping, or all the topics. So if you'll have input for us on that, please let us know. We are getting questions in the chat. I think you already have our email addresses to contact us at broadbandmapping@nc.gov and cabprogram@nc.gov. So we want to take a couple minutes to jump in on a few of these remaining questions.
Okay, we've had some questions that have been answered in there in the chat, but I'm going to go through. Can the county submit a protest to remove protected areas where an ISP reports service but does not provide service? Areas we've worked with HOAs and have documentation of no service.
Yes. So Deborah, I think what we would want to do is work with you directly. So a protected area is really an area, right, that's been flagged to receive funding, public funding. It doesn't mean it's built yet, but you could be talking about an area that where there's a sense that it's supposed to already have been built. So if you could work with us directly on that, that would be perfect.
Great. We had a couple of folks that asked, and it was answered here, but just so we get it directed to everyone, when do we need to submit priority areas? They have a
Yes.
deadline for that.
Yeah, so for the counties that Stephanie Jane mentioned, and so you could submit them now. The question would be if your eligible locations change after the protest, you may want to look at it again. So we would recommend waiting. The protest window will close January 29th. So if we don't get protests for your county, or if we resolve them quickly, that would mean January 30th, we could let you know, hey, there's no changes in your county. These are the eligible locations. So we need to figure out how we'll notify each county about the status of the protests. So we will figure that out and figure out how we'll post that on the website so you all know the timing. So again, you could send them now, but if you wait till say January 30th, we can let you know if there's protests or if the eligible locations are as we think they are.
Thank you. Next question, how do we deal with widely scattered unserved locations like the Swiss cheese one?
That is a great question. I don't know if we have an exact answer, as you know. So, CAB is unserved and underserved locations. So it's going to be up to providers to figure out how they can piece together applications in the best way possible. We do have the stopgap program following CAB, and then of course the BEAD program. We would, probably in a Swiss cheese situation, we're going to get applications from providers that have footprint in the area, but there's no magic answer to that. Is the short version. But Jeff, we'd be happy to talk to you offline about that too.
Thank you. Another question, if a county has limited CAB funds, how will we know how many BSLs we should be submitting?
And that is another good question. We don't have a magic answer on that. At some level, the more priority, if a county prioritizes areas, which you all are totally welcome to do, it does limit in some sense. It has the potential to limit responses that come in. So I don't know how to advise you. We'd be happy to talk to you offline. Just to be clear, all eligible locations in a county would be eligible to be included in a bid, regardless of whether you have priority areas or not. If you prioritize areas, that would mean that would be weighted a bit differently in the evaluation process. And that evaluation criteria will be published in the scope of work document that Jeff mentioned. So that's the main kind of missing piece that we need to get to you all to kind of have all this, to see how all this comes together. So that should be coming out in the next couple of weeks.
Thank you. Next question, any anticipated timing on the first county windows opening?
Yes, so when the protest window ends, we would have those eligible locations for that county, and then it will really depend on the county. If we have your commitment amount, it would just depend on whether you're prioritizing areas or not, whether you have any changes to the scope of work template, and otherwise we would be ready to post. So February, we anticipate posting at least some counties.
Great. The next question, is a letter of credit required for CAB?
That will be covered in the scope of work document, all of the kind of documentation that will be required in a bid. And the difference with CAB again is that with GREAT, for example, we made an award, contingent award, and then collected additional materials and then contracted. And so for CAB, since this is a bid, once we make an award, that is the contract. So it's taking a little longer on the front end to get that document out. But once we've made an award, it should be immediately contracted, which will be positive. But all of that will be covered in the scope of work document.
Great. There are a few questions here about if CAB funding can be used for affordability purposes, so not for broadband expansion, but to help offset the costs of broadband service. I see that Jeff had responded back that the Office of Digital Equity and Literacy has some grant programs available for that. Just wanted to make sure everyone was aware of those. And then we had a follow-up question about, is there a list of eligible costs that will be made available? I have a feeling that might be tied to that question as well.
Well, actually, the CAB guidance has covers some of that.
Perfect.
So that, and it's similar to, it's essentially infrastructure costs like GREAT.
Okay, and then we have one more question. Can you do a 50,000 foot overview again of what the protest process is for county knowledge? Like super brief overview.
Yeah, so it is a chance for broadband providers to submit a protest to say that a location that's reflected as being unserved in the map is actually served. So it's the same as essentially as what was in our great grant process. And that's the short answer.
Great. I know we are over time. We do have a few questions left if folks can stay on for just a minute or two. The next question is, are counties that choose to provide ARPA funds directly to an internet service provider outside of the state broadband program eligible for CAB?
So that legislation has changed again in the fall, and that is referenced in the CAB guidance document. So I don't want to misquote it, but essentially they look at tier 3 counties a bit differently. This is in statute. I can pull it up, or why don't we add it in the chat? Because I don't want to misstate, but so if you're a tier 3 county, there's certain requirements where you would not be able to participate in CAB. And we'll paste that language here.
Perfect. And for anyone that cannot access the chat afterward, we can add that to the web page as well, to the CAB web page, to make sure folks are on point there.
And I think it's in the guidance in like 3 places.
Perfect. And that, I believe, concludes all of our questions. I want to thank everyone so much for joining today and for putting in great questions. We will be adding a copy of this recording to the webinar later this week, although we're on Friday, so it might be early next week. But thank you for your great questions. If you have any additional ones, please email us at broadbandmapping@nc.gov or cabprogram@nc.gov. And we look forward to talking to you soon. Thanks so much.